This is section 10.1, part 4, the final part. All right, so we've made it to the conclusions. We are now going to talk about how we write a conclusion for our hypothesis test based on the decision that we make. Now, the odd part in doing this in section 10.1 is that we don't know how to make the decision. Remember, our decisions were to reject or fail to reject. We haven't talked yet about how we make that decision, but we have talked about those decisions. And so we're going to see how we can write our conclusion if we know the decision that was made. And then in sections 10.2 and 10.3, we'll look at how we make that decision based on our hypothesis test. All right, so according to the American Time Use Survey, the mean amount of time employed male Americans spend working on weekends is 5.46 hours. A researcher wonders if males employed part-time work more hours on average on the weekends. So we're going to write a conclusion for two parts. We're going to look at suppose the null hypothesis is rejected and state that conclusion. Then we're going to also look at what if the null hypothesis was not rejected. And we'll write that conclusion in just a moment. So again, I'm going to go to a new screen so I actually have room to write, but we're going to figure out how do we write this conclusion and what do we want to say in order to express what we found out based on our survey. All right, so the first thing that we always want to start off with when we're stating our conclusion is whether or not we had enough evidence. So if we suppose that the null hypothesis is rejected, that means that we have the evidence to reject it. So we'll start our conclusion with, there is sufficient evidence and I like to state my significance level. So in this case, we don't have that because we haven't been given all the information we need in order to run our hypothesis test. But there's sufficient evidence at the, and then remember we said alpha was our significance level. And so far, even though we haven't called it alpha, we've been saying that we need something at 5% or less. If we have that probability, then it would be unusual, and that's what we're going to be looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and just say at the 5% level of significance, because I like to put that in there. So this is kind of an extra piece right now. We don't know that it should be 5% or if they used a different value for alpha, but we're going to just go with it for right now. And so there's sufficient evidence at some level of significance that was used. To conclude, that, and then I'm just going to basically restate what I'm assuming. So to conclude that males employed part-time work more hours on average on weekends. And so I've got three main components. I tell if I have the evidence or not, so there is sufficient or insufficient evidence depending on my decision. I tell what level of significance I use, and we can talk more about that as we go through the examples in 10.2 and 10.3, but someone else could use just our own data and a different level of significance and end up with a different decision. And again, we just want to be as clear as possible of why we made our decision and what we used in order to do that. So we've got our level of evidence, we've got our level of significance, and then we have our context. What was it we were trying to use that evidence to decide? So in this case, we concluded that males employed part-time work more hours on average on the weekends. All right, so we have the same situation, but now we're going to say that the null hypothesis was not rejected. So we failed to reject the null hypothesis. What will the conclusion look like in this situation? All right, so again, we always want to start with whether or not we had the evidence necessary. So in this case, if we were not able to reject the null hypothesis, then we did not get the evidence we needed. So typically we'll say that there is insufficient evidence. And again, I would like to say at the, and you can use the alpha equals 0.05, or you could say at the 5% level of significance. And I'll end up using both sometimes. So there is insufficient evidence at whatever level of significance was used. In this case, we're assuming it's 5%. And then our hope or our context is still the same. So this time we have insufficient evidence to conclude that same thing. Males employed part-time work more hours on average on weekends. So there we go. That is our conclusion if we fail to reject the null hypothesis.